Oh yeah. These people are more smart than Andy. Yes, exactly. That's my point.
Totally true. Angela's not my boss. You know, I'm so excited. Finally, somebody's going to be telling me what to do. You know, Vivek has been so useless. It's been chaos. Now, thank God, we've got real leadership.
It's true. It's true. I feel much better about things since Angela's been around. Wonderful. Yes. All right. Sachin's on the clock today. He's planning on a big reveal in the middle of one of our slides. So Sachin, here goes. Thank you everyone for being here. We're very, very happy to have you all. One thing that we enjoyed about the last Fireside more than any of the content was the chat. And that's been true for many of the build track sessions as well. So please be active. This is the one meeting that we're going to keep the Zoom chat open as well as the Slack chat. The way I would think about it is the Zoom chat, of course, is more ephemeral. You can put your thoughts out there and we can just talk through them as a part of the conversation. And my job here is to be a conduit for your voices as Andy and Kevin go through a conversation on what's been a big, big week for Gitcoin and what is, I think, the next stage of the Ethereum story in general. So, so please be active in the chat. If you have stuff that you know you want people to see later, that's where Slack comes in handy. And Kernel General will also be active, I'm sure, with some of those links. And we'll go from there. I'll kick us off with a few slides. One, as a way of introduction, Kevin, you to KB3. There's 103 people in this group, and the group is an incredible group. In total, you have about 250 people that are in Kernel from 39 different countries across all time zones. They come from every educational background that you can imagine, from most of the large tech companies to the good side of the fence to Web3. A lot of great investment backgrounds from the traditional world and from the crypto world, and a bunch of the earliest of stages of founders and ideators in this next wave of crypto. So they're all here. Please give Kevin a warm welcome. We're very happy to have him. And there's a bunch of names that I just put on the list. We introduced the mentors to Kernel General this week, and you don't really have to read all of the names. You can just read Paolo's comment in the bottom of the slide. The Crypto Champions League has entered the chat in Kernel Slack. We introduced what we said was 30 plus mentors. It really was 60 plus mentors from all over crypto world. And not only crypto world, I'm looking at a name, Natty Zola, who's actually one of Kevin's introductions to us. He runs Techstars in Colorado. There's Andy Arts, who runs Social Capital, which is more of a regular venture fund that's trying to understand crypto, and Andy's excited to get to know people. Then you have the Jesse Waldens of the world, who are kind of deep down the crypto rabbit hole, and many of the top builders in interesting companies across the space. So the hope is that you get to take a solid look at this list. You know that their main intent in being a mentor is meeting you, and you tell us if you want to meet them. One of the first ways to do that is by mentioning it in the office hours Airtable, which maybe Sachin or Angela can link in the chat. I forgot to get it into the slide deck, but that office hours Airtable, as an aside, we're trying to figure out office hours. Office hours has still been kind of a struggle for us to play out, but anyone who puts something in that office hours Airtable and specifies the type of mentor they want to meet, even if it doesn't happen in Friday office hours, we will make sure that happens in the week that follows. So this group is here to be our peers, to be our stewards, and we're very grateful to have so many of them with us. So please give them a warm welcome as you see them joining in the Kernel Intros channel. We are in week one still of Kernel, so we're very early in the process. As many of you know, there were the first build track sessions this week. So Kev, for your reference, the first week was kind of just like interactive, getting to know each other type stuff. And week one is really more of the same, but we introduced the tracks. So you have the DeFi track, the security track, IDEO led the token track, Paul Gotti led the gaming guild, and then Adrian LaBosse leading culture. So all of those track introductions happened yesterday and then the day before. And hopefully you've gotten to meet some of the people down those tracks. And the one thing that we're asking of you all is your adventure page, so that, you know, with all of this content, with all these people, with all these things happening in Kernel, you can stay grounded in what it is that you hope to accomplish, which of course is living and breathing and can always change. But we hope you have at least a version 1 of it ready by Friday, so that we know all of the different types of things that people are trying to do. The questions here that we've talked about are, how might we build a better web for ourselves, for our own lived experiences? And then how, on an individual way, does it make the most sense for me to participate, given who I am? And we're excited to talk to Kevin to get some of these answers from him, because he's definitely chosen a way with Gitcoin that I've seen firsthand is so uniquely fitted to who he is as a person. And I hope that those adventures are going well. We're more than happy to work with you on them as the weeks go on. Just a V1, hopefully by tomorrow. And then from there, we get to weeks 2 through 7. I want to bring this back up. This was from the kickoff, and this is kind of my last slide before I pass the mic to Andy and Kevin to kick off into most of the Fireside. But this slide came up in the first kickoff, where we said there's really kind of like 3 main phases as we see it for anyone building anything. There's the incubation phase, where it's in your own mind, you're getting it out on paper for the first time, you're putting it in a place where you're willing to share it with a small group of close friends or collaborators. There's the accelerate phase, where you take it from your own mind and you put it out there at least to a small group of 4 to 5 people who can give you your initial feedback, who can say, hey, is this crazy or is this not crazy? And Kevin's a great person to have here, because I've seen how quickly he does this. He goes from incubate to accelerate in a matter of minutes, so regularly. And that's something that I'm excited for the future of the GTC ecosystem, because of that characteristic. I think fits even better in a decentralized context. But then you go from accelerate to growth, which is where you've gotten all of your user feedback. You've gotten to a point where you feel really confident doing a big public reveal of something that's taken a lot of time, a lot of cycles to get to. And very loosely, the structure is that weeks 2 and 3, we focus on incubate. Weeks 4 and 5, we focus on accelerate. And then weeks 6 and 7, we focus on sharing the story. But the reality is that we know that this is a circle. And we know that there's some people who are already at the growth stage who want to go out and fundraise with something that's pretty much a finished product. We know that there's people who want to go out and do their user testing now. So we're not going to dictate this to you, and you should not feel like the sessions are in some way holding you back. They're very much just kind of like the arc of the program. But the reality is that, like, as you make clear to us in your adventures and what you say in office hours, so on and so forth, we will find you where you are, and we will try to help in the ways that we can. So just keep an eye here. Sachin, I think on cue, is adding you to the track build channel, which is the overall build track. So you've already been in the sub tracks, which are your main majors or minors. Now the build track is kind of where, okay, you could share a prototype, or okay, you could share something that you're looking to get feedback on, no matter what track you're on. So yeah, I'm just gonna take a quick look at the chat to see if there's any questions. Your adventures totally can cover multiple projects, Naomi. You definitely can either tag yourself in an adventure that's existing or create a new one. So for example, if you want to join an adventure, if something seems compelling to you, just put your name, tag yourself there, say hi to the person whose adventure maybe originally listed it, but very easily you can tag those people on Slack and you can be involved in multiple. We're also playing with more things there. James Farrell asks, is there a way to book time with the mentors? That's the office hours Airtable, which I'm not sure I see in the chat, but if Sachin or Angela, you guys could put it in there, that'd be great. That would be the way to express interest in talking to a particular mentor. We'll do our best to make those interests happen. There's the Airtable. Thank you, Andy. Great. Thank you for all the hellos, super active in the chat. And I think this is my time to pass the mic. We'll start with Andy doing a bit of a sense of where we are. You don't have to go into all of these, Andy. I'll just play background from here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I will keep it very, very brief. If you look back in the recordings on the kernel websites, particularly the block 2 recordings, you'll get more detail about how everything is strung together, because that was a big part of those presentations. This week, if you've read the materials, you'll see that we begin with meaning and we move very quickly into value as the Web3 lesson, and is probably one of the ones that we'll spend time focusing on, given our guest today and his esteemable title of Philosopher King. And the curated material this week covers 4 sections. It looks at the history of seals and the notion of data integrity as it applies in ancient Sumer right up until the modern day with Nick Szabo. It looks at the first presentation Vitalik did about Ethereum in a more public context at DevCon 1 in London. It looks at the history of computing and something that Vinay Gupta calls unrecognizable capitalism, and then ties it all together and brings it back to meaning, which is probably the most difficult thing to talk about, with an incredible lady called Meili Ko, who was a designer at Apple and talks about joyful subversion. I'm really hoping we'll be able to get into each one of these topics with Kev today. And I'm really going to dive straight in because, as I say, he has gone on the State of the Nation Thankless podcast and claimed this title of Philosopher King. So we can't let him off so easily.
I think what I said was wannabe
Kev,
Philosopher King, but hold me to it for sure.
Wannabe is a keyword.
Well, already the vacillation begins, but we'll start.
Sure. I didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
Kev, one of the main points that's no, not at all. Never, please. You literally cannot interrupt my flow, dear friend. It's just a joy and an honor to have you here. And truly, we are incredibly grateful that you've taken the time to come and have a chat. And you know, it does, because like a big part of what Kernel is about is these peer-to-peer learning spaces and designing dialogue, which is a feature of the conversation that I want to get to. But I want to start with value. And one of the claims made in the Kernel syllabus is that value comes from trust in clearly shared truths. And that this kind of trust in clearly shared truths lies at the core of how we might generate valuable interactions between people. So given the recent launch of quadratic lands and GTC and the Gitcoin DAO, the first question as wannabe Philosopher King is, what kinds of truth are you most interested in sharing?
Great question. So I think that the biggest thing with Gitcoin for us has always been this mission of growing and sustaining open source software, and the idea that our digital infrastructure provides billions of dollars of value to the world, but the people who are working on it have no business model to capture any of that value. And as a result, you see people that go work at for-profit entities or just don't work on open source, they get burnt out and they move on. And that just felt really wrong to me, given how much value open source software creates for the world. And so I think that our truth at Gitcoin is that open source is good, and an extension of that is open source is this thing called a public good, which is something that's non-excludable and non-rivalrous, as opposed to something you can get on Amazon, which you can consume. A public good is something that Andy can consume, and it doesn't prevent me from consuming it because it doesn't have a limited supply. And it's non-excludable, which just means that open source is available for free and no one can really gate you from copying the code and using it. So because public goods are good, they create a lot of value for the world, but there's a asymmetry between value created by open source and value captured. And so our biggest truth is that that's a problem. And the hypothesis of Gitcoin is that we can change that with cryptocurrency. We now have programmable money, and we can program our values into our money. And if we truly value open source software, we could build monetary systems that get software developers paid. And I'm starting with software developers because that's my tribe, but I do think that it applies to other public goods like journalism, creative arts, and other such things. But we're starting with software engineers because that's a place to start where everyone in the crypto ecosystem needs software engineers, but also there's basically a ton of capital out there that's looking for software engineers, and software engineers are going to figure out nonces and transaction fees and all that kind of stuff before everyone else. So it's just a good place to prove out that this could work.
It's a fascinating point that software engineers will understand nonces and confirming transactions before everybody else, because one of the underlying features of this claim that value is generated by trust and clearly shared truths has to do with the fact of representation, right? So public goods are good is something that we both very much agree on. The question is, what are the ways in which we can represent value in ever widening perspectives, such that it's not just the ability to validate a nonce and confirm a transaction that gives you access to this new and perhaps different order of language that people are beginning to describe value in and share it. The syllabus sort of says, well, we create these shared truths through fiction, and fiction is one mode of representation of value, which is not necessarily numerical. I wonder if you've thought at all about how can we best and more widely, not even best, just how can we more widely represent value in a way that makes it accessible to people like journalists, to people like lawyers, to people like activists and social climate warriors, these kinds of folks who don't necessarily have a technical background, but definitely add significant value to our shared world and commons?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if the internet of value is quite there yet. And I like to use this allegory of the internet of information changed everything in society that relies on information, because now we could send information across a computer network, and that changed entertainment, media, politics, the way we engage with each other on social media. And now we have the internet of value, and we can send value across a computer network in a blockchain-based system. And so is that going to change everything in society about how value is transferred and value is represented? Now we have distributed consensus, and the obvious cases there are insurance and banking and jobs, and but the internet of information has a 30-year head start on the internet of value, and we're only what's been 10 years since Bitcoin. So we're very early in figuring that out. I hope the answer to your question, Andy, about environmentalists and people who are more off-chain is yes, but I think that we've got to prove it out in digital native public goods before we can move on to public goods for the remainder of the world. That's my hypothesis, I think.
Absolutely.
Just some stuff in the chat to keep everyone I know Chibu's mentioned he thinks that the internet of value really needs to get there quickly. Some talks about lawyers, science, programmers, journalists, public health as different areas. But to Kev, to your point, just one thing as we talk about this, the quadratic lens page and this screenshot coming from it is something that I think is worth spending some time on, because one of the things that Andy talks about here is the idea that we create shared truths through fiction, through our own stories. The best fiction that we had to organize ourselves for many, many moons was the firm, at least in productive, let's say, kind of like business endeavors. And now on the next slide, we have this thing. It's called GTC. It has a second chapter to the Gitcoin firm story, and it has this goal to build a DAO of DAOs. And maybe most specifically, it has a lot of stories behind it. It has a lot of allegory. It has a lot of beautiful imagery. It has a lot of love that's been put into what it is from a fiction perspective, i.e., you coming up with the quadratic lens as a meme and then building things around that. Maybe you could talk about that process first, and then the vision as well for like this thing that isn't really a firm anymore, but what you hope it becomes.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So we launched the Gitcoin token this week. If you haven't seen it, it's going to be the token that enables Gitcoin DAO. And basically what we're trying to do is get to this mythical place called the Quadratic Lands, a promised land in which there's more digital democracy and there is public goods that are well funded. And so if you can imagine a world in which market-based mechanisms are funding infrastructure, in whether that's physical infrastructure or digital infrastructure, and public goods are well funded, you can imagine a world where thousands of people can just work for the open internet and can just work for public goods. And that's the promised land. We need a vessel to get to the promised land. And we felt like the Gitcoin company was not the right vessel. After all, the company is domiciled in the United States and is beholden to its shareholders. And we wanted to have a community that's worldwide, that is governed by the community that it serves. And so the DAO is the vessel to get to the Quadratic Lands. One of the vessels. I think many of you out there also are building DAOs that support public goods, and we embrace that. That's why Gitcoin we're thinking it'll become a DAO of DAOs. We don't just want to solve public goods funding with quadratic funding. We want to go think one level up. And if we create a DAO of DAOs that is a generator function for public goods funding experiments, of which quadratic funding and Gitcoin grants is just one example. We also do some hackathons, which are a way of funding open source software. And in a way, I think Kernel, which was the genesis of Kernel, was out of the Gitcoin ecosystem, is one of the sort of, not like sub DAOs, but let's call it sister DAOs in this ecosystem. And I envision that we'll run a funnel in which Austin Griffith and I are running a public goods funding prototypes work stream. And we have programmable money. We value public goods. And so let's create prototypes of things that fund public goods. And so we're going to rapidly prototype things. We're going to mature those DAOs, the ones that work. And then we're going to eventually decentralize the ones that work and send them off into the world to do their mission. And so the generator function of public goods is what we're trying to solve. And for those of you who aren't software engineers, I'm a software engineer, so I talk like one. A generator function is a function that creates other functions. So basically, we want to build a DAO that generates other DAOs that fund public goods, and that's our deep reason for being. Same mission that we started with in 2017. We're just taking a little bit more systematic approach to it now.
So Kev, the notion of this mythical land is something that really interests me a lot. And one of the core drives of this particular slide, and also just the whole piece on value, is that, blockchains allow us to define succinctly our shared truths, but fundamentally the record itself is shared across many participants. So one of the overarching themes of the kernel syllabus is that throughout human history, we've kind of had these two separate records: the record of our transactions between one another and the record of our shared myths, which happen in quite different places and are owned by sort of competing and misaligned incentives. It's one of the problems of coordination games, which we will get to when we discuss Moloch in the comic book. But one of the things that blockchains fundamentally do is they merge these two records of sort of the transactions, i.e. our indebtedness to one another, and the stories that we tell. So, one of my thoughts around this mythical journey to the quadratic lands is, we seem to be as a species, right? Moving beyond a place where it's no longer just about myth or the sort of hero's journey. If you look later in the syllabus at the Douglas Rushkoff talk, he's talking about how this kind of Western narrative arc of problem, climax, sleep is falling apart, and we don't really care about a coherent narrative arc anymore, but we care about the meta layers of things, how one thing satirizes another, satirizes another, satirizes another. And my belief here is that really believable stories rely on this shared record, which merges both the narratives that we tell one another and the myths which underpin the stories by which we relate. And in this sense, Gitcoin is kind of really fascinating to me because it really began mostly in the transactional realm. You had bounties and then hackathons later on, and various different kinds of contributors and working groups happening in the last few years. And then you've used that public transactional history to distribute a narrative defined in economic code, which maps addresses to balances in a shared contract. And now you're going to use that shared contract to meld together the next chapters of the stories, in which, transactions and narrative are kind of one and the same thing. And I wonder particularly, this notion of GTC as a narrative, which is also economic code and is this mapping between addresses and balances based on a public and auditable history? Yeah, how do you think about this transactional narrative space, particularly as it applies to this like mythical journey that you want to undertake?
Yeah, I trying to wrap my mind around the question to start. I think that there's a little bit of a contradiction in in market-based mechanisms funding public goods. In that's that public goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, and basically, like, if you're creating a market-based mechanism that tracks everyone's ledger of balances and their, I don't know, call it their reputation or their balance or something like that, then there's an inherent scarcity to that contradicts with the non-excludability and the non-rivalrousness of public goods. And I think that that's a contradiction in any market-based mechanism that's going to fund public goods, much less a distributed ledger. My view is that there's like a purity spectrum of like pure public goods, something like an ETH client that will never ever have a business model, to something like Uniswap, which, you know, Uniswap is a Gitcoin grants alumni, and you know, they're amazing, and, you know, like having a liquid market that's decentralized is in a lot of ways a public good, although it's if it they're to write to the system, that part is not a public good. So a lot of these, there's like this nuance of, I really want to write a post about this, but like a nuanced view of public goods where a lot of these end-sided marketplaces will have one side of the market that's a public good and the other sides that are private. And there's a purity spectrum from private goods and things that will have a business model all the way to like the pure public goods, things like an ETH client, which will just never have a business model, but we all rely on because it's our infrastructure. And so I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is not be dogmatic and just be as pragmatic as possible about building liquidity across that spectrum, and like going from the impure and like the more pure, I shouldn't use the word pure, I should use like more transactional and like quid pro quo, to like the more pay it forward side of the spectrum. And if anyone's ever run a double-sided marketplace before, you know that they're subject to network effects. Every funder that joins Gitcoin makes it better for every developer, and every developer on Gitcoin makes it better for every funder. And so there's a network effect that once you get it spinning, it becomes this like self-perpetuating machine. And the job, like the sort of like trick is to start with the more like private goods, transactional side of the spectrum, and get enough momentum that you can actually move towards the more altruistic end of the spectrum. And so, you know, I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, Andy, but that's kind of how I think about using a ledger-based system to solve something as sort of like pure as public goods funding.
Sure. I mean, it's a really interesting answer. What I'm really trying to get at is that what is the point of myth, right? Why do we tell myths? And many people in this community always kind of quotes Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, right? Which to me is it's an interesting structure, but it's somewhat dated. And certainly if you listen to modern media theories, is no longer the way that the archetypal human modern consciousness functions, right? And Campbell actually wrote a book after that called Myths to Live By, which is an absolutely fascinating read. And you know, influenced a lot of people like Ken Wilber and Sex Ecology and Spirituality and many other kinds of classic books. And the reason that I mentioned the title is that it holds something of the key to the answer. Why do we tell myths? Well, they define the why we live. You know, it's this fundamental and deep human question. It's not just how to live best, which is itself a whole realm of inquiry, but why we live at all. Because it plugs into these archetypal realms, right? The archetype being not the you know, wizard or the joker or the unicorn or any of these things, but in fact the structure behind representation in the collective unconscious, if you follow Jung, right? And what's really fascinating to me is that like the record which we used to tell myths with, which is basically language and written symbols, and the record by which we transacted with one another were very, very separate things prior to 2009, really, right? And now all of a sudden you have this mythic narrative, right, about how we're going to do non-rivalrous, non-excludable public goods, journey to the quadratic lands together, where everybody can work for things that they really believe in with purpose and receive the stability and kind of income that they need to survive in the world. And the way that that's funded is like with a narrative structure that it's still like underlying in an archetypal sense, right? But like the archetype here is a literal mapping that we can look at of like addresses to balances, right? And that's, it's really interesting to me, and it's just something to reflect on. I think particularly as we talk about mythical journeys, is like, well, we now have this whole suite of tools by which to understand like the archetypal impulses behind the myths that we tell, and that's really fascinating.
One thing I might just to like color it. There's like something related to this from the meaning article that I always look at and kind of gets my head spinning. It's kind of the bottom here, which is just like looking at this shared record that Andy just referred to. This is a Simon de la Riviere quote about the benefits of knowing that a computation was verifiably done is like inventing religion for programs. With verifiable computing protocols, a program will know the minds of other programs. There's like a innate, like, I know what you're up to in this that like kind of didn't exist before. There's no longer servers and data logic connected disparately. They're all viewable and you can engage with them in real ways. And Kevin, take us wherever you want to go. But when you brought up the like practical, like, okay, these are the types of things that we need to do to get a network effect going. That's like one practicality that I thought about. Another one, which is very obvious, recent, was Akita, which is like kind of like one of the first big governance things that's been happening in the GTC world, just in time for there to be a governance token for which we can like explore these. And now like one of the main proposals there is to use Sablier to lock up Akita tokens for a period of time in a way that is using this concept, this like religion for programs, this shared record, where we can now kind of like tell the Akita and GTC story together on a shared public ledger in an open way. And it's just kind of like a thing that never would have happened in any prior context that I can think of.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that what blockchain and programmable money give us is the tools to coordinate. I'm a big fan of the prisoner's dilemma and learning about how if humans coordinate instead of defect and can trust each other, then they can do amazing things. And the other thing that I see that blockchains give us is, as you noted, verifiable computation, transparent, immutable economic games where the rules cannot be changed on you. And, I think that as a programmer, that really resonates with me. But one of the things I'm learning as a leader or a wannabe philosopher king is that I don't think that I can organize the work. Like there's just the space of possibility here is just unbounded. I mean, we're in this punctuated equilibrium that's been enabled by these new tools. And so the strategy with the quadratic lands, just to bring it back to the realm of myth really quick, Andy, is that if we want to build this vessel to the quadratic lands, to this better promised land, there's this quote about if you want to build a ship, don't assign people tasks to go out and get wood and to build a ship. Teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. And one of the things that we're doing with the quadratic lands is building this myth of a place that public goods are well funded in. Like, what would it look like? I mean, there'll be vaporwave memes. That's the obvious part. But like, how much do we program serendipity into our economic environment? Like, the problem with public goods is it's too economic. It's like, I'm an economist and they're non-excludable and non-rivalrous. And like, if I corner you at a cocktail party and I talk to you for 10 minutes, I can convince you public goods are good. But like, what's the mimetic, like your life is better because you're living here thing? And like, that's what we're viscerally trying to do with the quadratic lands. And then people can build their own ships to the quadratic lands once they long for the endless immensity of the sea, or the quadratic lands in this case. And so that's been a step change for me, is recognizing that the space, the computational space is unbounded, and we can do more good by empowering other people than building the tools ourselves. And I think that, Kernel is an example of that, and so is Gitcoin grants.
Look, if you drop Rumi quotes in the middle of a presentation, you can drop the wannabe from the philosopher king parts. And it does, that is very much in line, I think, with a lot of what the kernel syllabus is trying to point out, which is that the myth provides the why. Like, yes, blockchains are these incredible coordination tools by virtue of the verifiable and global compute infrastructure that they set up. And we can talk about coordination surfaces and all of these fancy terms, but it doesn't drive at the main question again, which is why, to what end do we coordinate? And the myth is what provides that. And one of the to sort of ground this in again, like real history and anthropology, the first piece of this week's curated readings is a piece by Nick Szabo on the history of seals as they relate to data integrity, provenance, and checksums. Some of the earliest writing was in fact developed as a function of producing bills of lading at warehouses in ancient Sumer, where they would like draw, they began by sort of putting into clay envelopes tokens which represented the number of sheep or the number of bales of wheat or whatever goods you had stored with the warehouse keeper, and then you would take away your clay envelope which had been sealed, and checksummed with the number of goods that you had stored there, and then you would bring it back and you would literally break the seal and claim back whatever goods you had. And what's most fascinating about this whole history, apart from the fact that like these kinds of debt instruments were in fact what led to the development of writing and cuneiform and the first versions that we have of the written word, is a much deeper point, which is that these seals, the thing that provided data integrity, were the means of securing trade and trust. But they're also the means by which we could understand the network within which they operate, right? So we can go back and find a seal which we know was made in ancient Sumer in Mali, and we know, oh my God, this trade network extended all across the entire Middle East and in fact into Africa, because this seal that we found and we know to be a feature of what they used and made in Iran is in Mali. And so you can kind of map the network by the means which is used to secure the network, which is totally fascinating and still really interesting today. And I wonder, are there new ways of using cryptographically secured data to investigate this concept of integrity in a broader mimetic, mythical sense? How do you think about integrity? How does it apply to the DAO of DAOs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as noted on the slides right here, verifiable computation makes it so that it's easy to verify that someone is acting in a trustful way and coordinating. And integrity, in my definition, is the attribute of someone that you can trust, who over time has built up the proof, has shown that they will coordinate and not defect. And I think that one of the things I'm really excited about to see into the blockchain space, excited and a little bit scared, is identity. Basically, every financial transaction we do in the real world has to do with identity and has a certain level of vulnerability and trust in every single relationship. And so basically, like, right now, the blockchain system is just naive. Like, every address is the same as every other address to most smart contracts. And it's because we don't have identity. We can't say like, oh, Andy and I have known each other for 4 years and we always have interesting conversations every time we're together. Like, in the space of transacting with Andy, I want to act in X way. But if I haven't, and Anon, who I have no shared reputation with, then I would want to act in another way. And so identity scares me because I don't want to see people doxed on chain, and I want them to be able to only reveal information about themselves that, like, when you go to a liquor store and you buy alcohol, you have to give the clerk your address and name and birthday. And like, it's crazy. Like, why can't you just reveal, oh, I'm over 21? At least here in the United States, you have to be 21 to buy liquor. And so with blockchain identity systems, I think it's really important that we keep them more private, but there is a ton of upside to building those into the ecosystem. And I hope that for Gitcoin DAO, we start to build that delegated trust and integrity into the governance of the system. But it's very early days, and we'll see how it evolves.
So one of the things that I take from your answer there, apart from the fact that we've had many wonderful conversations, including some around, fires in Berlin and others, which I genuinely and deeply value, is that there is something quite deeply personal and human about this notion of integrity. And yet there's also the very specific technical and dry definition of data integrity is that which hasn't been tampered with in a cryptographically secure way. And figuring out means of trying to bridge this notion of personal integrity, which has to do with how I identify how vulnerable I feel I can be in certain spaces, whom I trust, whom I don't trust, how that influences the way I behave, with the kind of cold objectivity of a checksum or a hash, is a very interesting space in which to operate. Are there any any particular approaches that you've seen that interest you the most in these kinds of things? And also, I mean, like, one of the things that I want to kind of drive to with this question is that the title of this article is called the Play-Doh Protocols, which to me is really fantastic, a wonderful double entendre there from Nick. And one of the features also of this week's module, as it particularly is emphasized in the final piece by Maybe Co and Joyful Subversion, is play, right? Is this notion of, like, in a world, in an empire of lies, it's not just telling the truth that is a revolutionary act, but having a space of love and play. And I wonder if there are interesting ways of bridging the personal identity and integrity with data integrity through how we play with one another and what that means for coordination.
Right, for sure. I think that cryptographic hashes are cold. Technology, I think, in a lot of ways is like relative to the values that you put into place. To what do you use the technology for? Is it to enable people to eliminate suffering and to make them come together? Like, arguably, the reason that we exist is to convene with each other and to share each other's company and to be together. And is technology being used to enable those things, or is technology just just like extracting from you and like lording over you? And I think that it's in the application of cryptographic hashes that they become less cold or more cold, I guess, depending on what they're being used for. But yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of your question there.
Well, it's something that we'll come back to when I get to this piece of life as a work of art, and the notion of playing together.
Play, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Before we get there, though, let me just bring us back, because, as you say, like, technology is fundamentally about how we use it. Often, the tools themselves don't carry great moral weight in either direction. One of the arguments that Vinay Gupta makes in Unrecognizable Capitalism is that large-scale computer-to-computer connections allow us to create a shared worldview between lots of different organizations. This seems to me to be able to sort of play into your concept of DAO of DAOs, but very much, and in particular, I'd love to hear a little more about the collaboration with Gitcoin, Block Science, and Common Stack, especially around this notion of computer-aided governance, right? Because that seems to play into almost directly what you've just said, and how we might use really advanced computer tools to aid governance, to aid human actors, rather than disempower them or remove them entirely from these seemingly so-called autonomous systems.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points here, and I'd love to riff on any of them. The importance of play, the use of computer-aided governance is another one, and a shared worldview. I think it was the Vinay Gupta, how you framed that. And so, yeah, just to tug on the last thread, because my mind operates like a stack, and that was the most recent thing that you said. Basically, quadratic funding relies on civil resistance, and basically, like, you can cheat quadratic funding if you make up new identities, and we don't have a good identity mechanism in Ethereum yet. And so part of that's one of the things that's going on. The other thing that's sort of going on with governance of Gitcoin grants is that it's now moving $2 million per quarter, which is a non-negligible sum of money. And the Gitcoin team kind of felt uncomfortable making decisions about what constitutes fraud and what doesn't. Like, it's a very hard question to answer. And so the idea of hiring Block Science and working with them and the community stewards was to kind of like create more transparency around what should the policies be for Gitcoin grants and for governance of quadratic funding, which I view as not a finished thing. It's an open research question. What constitutes fraud in quadratic funding? Vitalik and Glenn told us that that would be a problem, but they didn't figure out how to solve it yet because they weren't running any systems in production that do quadratic funding. So it's been really fun to work with block science and have these really smart people trying to create an anti-fragile quadratic funding mechanism, which is sort of just like a blocker to getting us to the quadratic lands where public goods are well funded.
To what extent does it matter who you play with?
I think that, well, I mean, play is, to me, it feels like a space of trust where it's like funny, like I have kids and, you know, it's funny to be an adult and to try to describe and like verbalize what play is. Like, you know what play is when you're doing it. And so it's just hard to articulate what it is, but it feels like a high trust space to me.
Are there, you know, ways in which we can think about means of, you know, really only revealing the things that are necessary? So this example that you give of having to tell your whole life story to the clerk when you want to buy certain kinds of goods, instead of just revealing what's absolutely necessary. Are there ways in which one can do that such that we can play these global coordination games? You know, one of the articles which has been shared by Hamad or MetaDreamer in Kernel this time around is an old article from Virgil Griffith, where he makes the argument that Ethereum is a game-changing technology. And he means that literally in terms of game theory and the way in which having a global public deterministic network which executes a Turing complete script in a clear and deterministic way allows us to warp games that would have been competitive into coalition games. So like, what actually do you need to know about me in order for us to play in a loving and trusting way?
Right, totally. Yeah, I would agree that Ethereum is a game-changing technology in the sense of a coordination game. And Virgil Griffith had a really great post about how basically like we could change the incentive gradient of the prisoner's dilemma so that it's way more effective and beneficial to coordinate than to defect, which is, you know, I think viewing it as a multiplayer game and realizing that your actions have consequences on other people is really important. Not just externalizing those consequences to other people. And so Ethereum, I think, allows us to program incentive gradients for the world and maybe create a shift towards more play for more multiplayer economic games. And what I really love about that is that hopefully we can come together as a species and as a community and create economic systems that feel more fun, that feel more like play. But I'm also sort of a ruthless pragmatist in that, like, if something's a zero-sum game, like, I don't know if you can just reprogram it to be a positive sum game. There might be some sort of resource that's being metered that needs to be changed in order to make it a positive sum game. And that gets into matters of funding and politics as much as it does programming and computability, which is, maybe I'm discovering 4 years into crypto why people care so much about governance.
One question, if you don't mind, with the play that we're talking about, there's a lot of dog coins that have entered the world recently, and many more puppies running around in crypto world. Maybe the Akita story, and I know, Kevin, you're not the arbitrator here, you're just somebody who's in the GTC community. Likely not.
I'm not making the decision.
Yeah, not engaging. Yeah, but maybe you could talk about that game and how it's been interesting, how I can also speak to it, how the community has kind of come slowly towards solutions that do feel like they took a situation that in any other circumstance, this would have been a defect situation. And it seems like there's a real life example of us aiming towards cooperation, not us as in the people on this call, but the way the community is trending.
Yeah, I would love to ping pong back and forth with you on this, Vivek. I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I don't know, maybe that's the point of inviting me here.
Yeah,
So basically,
I'm happy to kind of go into the if you want
story,
into the into the story. Do you want me to do a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So TLDR here for anyone who didn't see this fun news last week. And this is a big thread. If you really want to see the nuts and bolts of what governance is about, 160 messages about what to do with the $500 million in Akita dog tokens that were gifted to the Gitcoin grants multisig. These came from Vitalik. Vitalik sent it to the Gitcoin multisig, $500 million worth of that token. The same day, he also sent $1 billion to the crypto COVID relief fund. The tricky thing is that those Akita tokens did not have all that much liquidity. And in the quickest action that one could have taken to try to sell all these tokens, the 500 million would probably turn into like 2 million, and the 1 billion would probably turn into like 10 million. And so there's this big, steep decline in the value of these tokens if quick action were to have been taken. Lots of chitter chatter about this has led to some interesting proposals. One from Shreyas Arhan, who actually was in Kernel Block 2, runs a community called Llama that's interested in managing protocol treasuries and helping them come up with decisions. I don't even know what this proposal was. This one was 15 days ago, but I know that he's made a more recent proposal, which is the one we referred to earlier, which is some amount of, I think, selling, perhaps burning the tokens. I might miss that part. And then the vast majority, 90% of the tokens going into a Sablier stream, where for the next 2 years, these tokens get released incrementally. We, as people on chain, can't do anything, right? Have to follow Sablier's code there. So there's no trusting that somebody's not going to just like go out and take it earlier. Literally, no one can if it's in that stream. And the instincts of the proposer seem to be that there's the potential that over the next years, the Akita community can build something interesting, and that potentially more money could go towards public goods in that scenario. I'll stop there, but that's what I know of the story.
Yep. So Vitalik gave these doggy tokens to Gitcoin. I think there's a counterfactual world this did not happen, but it would have been possible to dump those tokens and to bring the Akita market down in the process. And through governance, I can't speak for what governance is going to decide, but I think that there's a multiplayer coordination game that we played here where Gitcoin's network and talent network and brand can be used to accelerate Akita into something that is more than what it is right now, and potentially create public goods funding in the process, but also not destroy the market for Akita tokens. And so there's coordination that's happening with that. And it kind of reminds me of, like, I've been talking to the Akita core dev team, and it just reminds me of, like, I've been working on startups for 15 years at this point. And I remember starting out and just wanting to make it and just having a chip on my shoulder and trying to gain legitimacy. And I mean, Gitcoin, I think, is like, we've achieved some level of legitimacy, but it's been like 15 years of failing to get here. And so, I just have a ton of empathy for the Akita team and am trying to build rapport with them and trust so that we can play together, so that we can create something better for the world together. And I don't know if it's going to work or not, but I think it's taking the chance that is sort of the fun part.
Well, there's the key, right? I think to many of the threads on which we've been pulling is this active and sincere search for empathic response, right? One of the features of the Maybe co-piece in particular, she talks about like turning the living of life into an artwork. And the question is, like, what is the primary means we have of doing that, of making arts with our lives? And certainly Kernel, the syllabus, contends that it is about designing dialogue. And so in search of these more empathic spaces in which it is easier to be vulnerable, in which it is easier to meet the other as they are, see the struggles that they're going through, and come to some kind of shared coalition game that you can play together, which is positive sum. You know, what kind of conversations would you like to see in and about quadratic lands going forward?
I think that it is of paramount importance that we figure out how to fund public goods in the information age. We have this industrial age mechanism for funding public goods through taxation, which has a high administrative overhead and is coercive, and it incentivizes a lot of tax dodging. And I don't want to get into the politics of that, and nor do I think that we have the time to. But I do think that just recognizing that we're moving from a world in which the primary mechanism for human coordination is through industry and the nation state to the information age, which web-based systems are how we coordinate with each other. And that sounds really dystopic when I say it, because like I think Facebook and LinkedIn are just extracting from me all the time. I'm like Neo in the Matrix being extracted from as like a human battery for my data. And I think that the whole idea of Web3 is that we can build systems that honor what it is to be human and create sovereignty for the individual. And the really scary thing is that if we just build a decentralized casino with Ethereum and with blockchain space, then there's not going to be any mechanism for public or common goods to be coordinated in the future. And so just having that sense of urgency is something that I come back to, especially as someone who has a family and who has kids and want to see a more utopic world and a less dystopic world for them as possible. I just remain systematically focused on this mission of creating funding models that are multiplayer games that bring us together, not apart. And hopefully that means funding community goods and creating more serendipity in our economy. It's really a very, I don't want to say godlike power, but it's like a superpower to be able to program the laws of economic gravity. Like, can you imagine when you first saw an airplane? Like the Wright brothers demonstrated an airplane that could like subvert gravity back in the early 1900s. Holy smokes, that must have been such an amazing moment for so many people. But now we just take it for granted because that technology has been around for 100 years. We now have the ability to program the rules of economies. And so, even if public goods funding is hard, then I still think we can program our economics to fund community goods and to coordinate over defect. And if the Wright brothers can build a vessel that can subvert gravity, why can't we build a vessel that subverts like people's if someone has a selfish motive, like we could subvert that and make systems that are more collective than individualistic. So that's sort of my hope. But I'm very privileged to be where I am and have parents who supported me from the start and put me where I am. And I think it's just paying that forward as much as possible is my hope.
Kevin Owocki, the philosopher king. Thank you. That's a wonderful response. Take away the wannabe. Come on, you've quoted Rumi. You've given a fantastic answer about subverting gravity. I
actually removed that from my Twitter bio, and I'm going to have to stop using it because now we're a DAO, and I didn't want to imply that I was like lording over anyone by calling myself a philosopher king. So now I'm a Web3 citizen. Now that we're a DAO, I hope that you all are too.
Yeah, we're all peers on this wonderful world. Thank you so much, Kevin. We have a bunch of Q&A that started. Tina, to answer your question, you can post them in Zoom or on Kernel General. How do you feel about some quick fire here, Kevin?
I've been putting out fires all week, so I don't think there's any quick fire you can throw at me that I can't handle. Let's do it.
I know that that's true. Okay, first one with the most upvotes from the Kernel General channel. How much should we program serendipity into our economic games? This is a quote of yours. How do you think about it? What do you think about that question?
Yeah, so I mean, when I talk about the quadratic lands, what I'm trying to do is move from like talking like an economist, like non-excludable, non-rival risk goods, like, to something that's more visceral. Like everyone knows the feeling of serendipity and just having chance luck that just feels like it appears out of nowhere. And it feels amazing to have luck in your economics, in your social relationships, in your love life. And when it happens all at once, it like just like wells up and feels amazing, like viscerally. And so like moving from talking like cold and economics to like the visceral result of, can you imagine if we all funded community goods and all came together and we created an environment around us that was like, it would feel like serendipity. It would just feel like I'm getting lucky all the time. But it's actually like programmed into the environment around you. And that's why I talk about serendipity, because I think it's more visceral than talking like an economist.
Agreed.
Was that the question? Did I answer the question?
Yeah. I think that was great. Cool. We'll keep it rolling. We have Tina. So Tina, if you're willing to unmute, feel free to. I know Tina works in design and engineering at Zapper right now. Previously at Google. Sounds awesome. I'm really excited to meet her soon.
Wow.
Tina, if you want to ask your question, please feel free.
Yeah. I just want to get your opinion, both like Kevin and Andy. I noticed when I was getting into space that a lot of the DAO structuring is similar to shareholder meetings, like how you delegate votes. It's similar to shareholders getting extra votes in these DAOs. And like the structure of voting is similar to board of directors, but that traditional finance structure has seen a lot of abuse of power. So what do you guys both see in like empowering these players, but also sustaining like verifiable trust, and how to like empower the checks and balances of that?
Thanks. Is that a question for all three of us, or should I answer it? Sorry.
Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that one of the things that I worry about a lot is like the internet of money is going to change everything about society that relies on money. And like right now we're all focused on DeFi and like speculation, but like what about the internet of jobs? Jobs rely on money, and like the gig economy, I think is like really scary to think that we could be creating a giant gig economy where people are just like, there's a board of directors that are extracting from you. And I think the consent of the governed is the only legitimate basis for a government, as opposed to like a divine right of kings. Like Upwork, I think of as like they have a board of directors, they take as much money out of the economy from the workers as possible, and they have like a divine right of kings. And like one of the things we wanted to do with Gitcoin DAO was be governed by the community that we serve. And, that is hopefully creating at least more of the consent of the governed. But there is, I'm trying to use this fancy camera, it just turned off on me. There is this thing in economics called the Matthew effect, which is basically like the compounding gains associated with accumulated capital. It's just basically the rich get richer. And so there's this compounding effect where like capital is just like earning more than labor. And because of that, the system is captured by capital and doesn't serve the needs of labor anymore. And one of the things that I think is really exciting about quadratic voting and quadratic funding is that it reprograms economic gravity to favor the little guy or the little girl, and creates more digital democracy. Like democracy is basically like one person, one vote, as opposed to one token, one vote, which is like a more capitalist economic system. So I don't know, there's a proposal coming to Gitcoin DAO to use quadratic voting at the base layer, and I'm really excited for the fireworks when that comes out. Like I will have way less voting power as the original founder of Gitcoin when that comes out, but I think it's a more just vessel for long-term being the consent of the governed. So yes, to answer your question, it does sort of resemble boardroom governance in a lot of ways right now, but we now have programmable money. And so we can program more democratic boardroom governance, I think, and we can hopefully put the community of users we serve in charge of the governance of projects that we have, which I don't think has been done in recent history. So that's why I'm excited that this time it's different, but hold me to it as Gitcoin DAO evolves.
Cool.
Andy, what do you think? I don't know if that was just a question for me or not.
Tina, thank you very much. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I also am excited about quadratic voting and what Kev has mentioned, particularly at the base there. But my thoughts are different. I don't think that democracy is a system we should seek to emulate. I think that the notion of the very premise of democracy is something which is really tied to coercive government, right? The fact that you hold a vote and that somebody ends up as a winner and somebody ends up as a loser is a fundamental premise of how democracy operates, which I think is not possible to get around no matter how programmable it is. And so this is why I think that you see a lack of creativity in terms of coming up with new and different governance structures in DAOs, which almost always end up institutionalizing very, very similar forms of stuff that we already have, just in a different medium, which to me is fundamentally uninteresting. So I agree with you. And the kind of deprogramming of our own political conditioning that has to happen is immense. And I think will take a very long time still before we truly understand what it means, what consensus really means, right? Because consensus is not agreements, and consensus is not democracy. Consensus is dialogic space in which the truth is spoken until every single open issue is addressed. And that is something fundamentally different to holding a vote in which the majority ends up winning and the minority ends up losing and are forced by some kind of violence and coercive means to follow along, even if those means are economic, right? So my answer is less practical in some respects than Kevin, because I don't think that we should be seeking to emulate digital democracies. And I think that we need to be much more creative about learning the lessons that consensus has to teach us in the technical protocols that we use. And the place where I'm most interested about that learning is indigenous organizations. So you'll find a section of the Kernel website called Conversation, which speaks a little bit to this kind of stuff. And it's something that I'm very happy to explore in a Yunto, because there's a whole world of conversation to be had there.
Yeah, maybe we let that one sit for a while, but Tina, thank you for kicking off what will be a wonderful conversation. Lots of chitter chatter about this, Andy, in chat. The best of the comments is when Andy says something is fundamentally uninteresting. I think there's a meme for that. Somebody please add it. One with 6 upvotes that just came out was from Shadi. Shadi is leading a project called Open Ciencia, which is about scientific research and the public good that is scientific research. Shadi, if you want to answer your question, ask your question, please feel free to unmute.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Vivek. Yeah, my name is Shadi, founder of Absentia. We have a team here in Kernel, and we're really interested in building out a decentralized science stack. And we're watching, very, very closely how Gitcoin evolves, because a lot of the incentive structures that you guys will be building out as we build, as you think about how we can provide a platform for public goods contribution that rewards the creators, I think could really naturally translate to the scientific process. So one sort of, as a scientist, one sort of concept I've really, been thinking a lot about is adversarial collaboration, right? So where in science, you need to be your own worst enemy, and your colleague's worst enemy, and kind of think of ways how you could converge to the truth, right? Constantly weighing the counterfactual and finding ways to converge to the mean over time. And I think a lot of that sort of process, might, as when you first come into science, you might think it's very harsh. It's very, it could cause a lot of ego damage for some people. But I believe that it's a form of play, or it could be conceived of as the form of play. And I'm thinking of how scientific collaboration, or even strength building through challenge over time, using compassion or compassionate means over time could build this like a cool process of trust, right? So where we trust those individuals who can play fairly, who can challenge us to be stronger and to think outside the box. Yeah, so I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts were on how do we collaborate but not also fall into groupthink, but how do we promote adversarial sort of interactions but not turn into kind of a feudalistic war state.
Right. My old man is an academic and is a physics professor at University of Delaware. And one of the reasons I got into computers is that I was the first kid on the block to have a computer as a kid, because of you imagine like growing up without computers. This is like, a very elder millennial thing. But I actually tweeted, one of his colleagues emailed me and they're like, hey, I saw like crypto and NFTs are taking off. Do you think NFT or crypto could be used to fund academic research? And so I tweeted it, And I got a bunch of interesting responses from people who are working on projects that are funding academic research. And it was really heartening to see, because I do think that knowledge that comes out of academia is in some ways a public good, and having new funding models for that is really exciting for me. Your second point on adversarial behavior, I think, sort of reminds me of the peer review process in academia. Is that sort of what you're talking about? Like, basically, if it's peer reviewed, then it's better science as a generalization than a paper that's not peer reviewed. Is that what you sort of meant by adversarial behavior?
Yeah, or even, one really interesting example is if I put up a model that seeks to predict, say, some disease state, right? And the stakes are really high for predicting this disease state. And if my model converges on some set of patterns, say, these patterns are related to different personality metrics, the stakes are really high, because then we're saying that this disease state is related to this personality metric. And one way you could kind of combat against this premature convergence to a set of explanatory factors is by promoting people, or providing a place or a platform where the counterfactual could be tested, right? So kind of like the Hilbert's Prize in mathematics, where the more and more important a proof becomes, the more and more important it becomes that we try to disprove it.
Right. Yeah, it sort of reminds me of sort of like adversarial neural networks, where you have like one intelligence that wants to optimize for X, and another intelligence that wants to optimize for negative X. And as they play their iterative game, the outcome is that you get a more hardened result for whatever game you've programmed there. And I think that, like, one of the hard things here is like, what is the game theoretic game that you're playing is different from, like, how do people feel when they're playing it, like, emotionally. And I'm reminded of, Vivek, you might remember this, but with Gitcoin grants round like 5, we put in negative voting, where you could like negative fund someone's Gitcoin grant, which is equivalent, like negative funding someone's grant $1 is equivalent to giving like 2 cents to every other grant in the round. And I remember Vitalik talking about how this is like a very rational economic thing to put in there. But the result was that it really caused a lot of hurt feelings on the platform to see who is negative funding who. And so, I'm wondering about the game theoretic space that you're designing, but also the emotional space of the player is like one externality that I would encourage you to design for as you're building your startup. Vivek, do you remember that? Anything to add there?
Yeah, no, it checks out. Yeah, there's very human elements to making sure that the play can go on, which was being hindered by something that was in theory, game theoretically optimal. But what was more important was that Gitcoin grants was an inclusive, enjoyable space. To keep going, I think Peyton, who works at MakerDAO and governance, was talking about combating plutocracy of governance tokens. I think perhaps quadratic funding is kind of like the main thing that you have, Kevin. I don't know if there's anything else you have to add, but that was the question about like making sure community has a say in decision making.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say that I think token voting will over time lend to plutocracy, and that's why I'm excited about quadratic voting at the base layer of Gitcoin DAO. I have to convince the large holders of the tokens to vote for it, which will be maybe a fun protocol politician thing that I have to do. And the thing I'll say is that, there's this concept of skeuomorphism in design, which is basically like, how much does the digital world resemble the physical world? Like, how much of what we're designing these systems is something that already existed before, but is in just a new medium. And I do think that we're gonna go across this threshold in which skeuomorphism will no longer be a thing, and we're going to design economic systems that never could have existed before without programmable money. And right now, DAO governance might look like boardroom governance, but once we go over that threshold, it could be completely reinvented in the new world. I think it should look more like democracy. Andy and I will have to disagree on that. But the point is that we're rapidly experimenting and innovating in this with blockchain technology.
Yep. Cool. To take it one level further, which is maybe thinking about this, This question is from Roman, who is working on a cool project called Paladin. I'll just put it on the screen for a second. You can take your governance tokens and send it to other committed members to leverage their vote. You can be paid to do so. In Gitcoin's context, I'm curious how this type of thing would work, because you can already delegate votes in the Gitcoin system, but just a really cool project. The question is in Kernel Slack and has to do with moving from token communities to true commons. So I think that the premise that Roman is getting at is that token holders represent at some basic level private holders of a particular community, even if it is an open community. How do you think about those token communities contributing to commons? And this ties to something else that was happening in chat earlier. Someone was kind of asking like, well, is Uniswap a DAO? And one of the cool things that I've seen in Uniswap grants that I think many other grants programs personally should be trying to do is going well beyond their personal mandates in terms of commons. Luckily for Gitcoin, commons is the mandate, but how do you think about that? The narrow goals of the token community versus the commons, and like how to play both into governance, I guess.
Totally. Really great question. And I think that you're asking one of the hard questions, which is something, this is like, before I answer, like, I want to be very clear and honest with you that like, this is one of the things that I think about when I'm like staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. And I think that the answer is that purity spectrum from pure public goods all the way down to things that are a little bit less pure public goods, but still have an aspect of public goods to them. And it just requires you to be able to understand, to like have nuance in these systems. Like these are double-sided marketplaces or sometimes triple-sided marketplaces. And one side of the marketplace is going to have scarcity and like tokens maybe in it, and the other side of the marketplace is a public good. And so like with Uniswap, I think that having like a decentralized exchange and the ability to have high liquidity in it and pricing coming out of it is a public good. But in order to transact on the other side of the market, then you actually have to have tokens, which are rivalrous. And so the thing is just to recognize that these things are part public good and part private, and to just like embrace that. And we're going to try to build liquidity across the entire funnel. And then the last thing I'll say is that in the blockchain space, people are either altruistic or trying to build a brand. And I think it's really great that Uniswap Grants is funding the commons. And, you know, they're either doing that because they want to give back or because they're building a brand for themselves as good stewards in the community. And I think that both are valid reasons to support community goods.
Cool. Seems like it's keeping Roman up at night too. So maybe you can message him at 2 a.m. if you need a friend.
Hey man, how do we fund public goods? I can't sleep.
Cool. Andy, are you seeing anything or anything catching your attention to Fast Next? Otherwise I can keep rolling.
Keep rolling. I really love this concept. It was an extension of the adversarial thinking brought up by Shadi. You know, Zorit says in Aikido practice, we do adversary practice through successive approximations of full-on attacks in a spirit of cooperation. And that to me, again, you know, the reason that adversarial collaboration is possible in science is because there is this focus on shared truth, right? And so if it's shared truths that create value, and the myth that you're instantiating as the reason for going on any journey is itself about developing shared truths, you have this really interesting recursive structure that allows you to practice in like an iterative fashion that gets closer and closer and closer to the truth, right? Without ever actually being able to say it, because that's one of the features of meaning and truth, is that you can't. But exploring the space around the truth is often as interesting as the truth itself. So that's a really interesting point from Zori. It's not really a question, but one worth reflecting on. And Shadi, thank you so much for bringing up this whole thing about adversarial collaboration is really what I mean when I talk about consensus, right? That is something that's genuinely fascinating to think about in terms of consensus, particularly.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah. it'll bring me, I think, to the last two questions that relate to shared truths and potentially absolute truth, which maybe is a good place to end on with something from Andy. There's one from Mike that I think is really relevant to Kevin, what your life has been, which has been partially making sure that the on-chain data associated with Gitcoin is in a good spot. The Gitcoin grants is set up, the product is working, that quadratic funding is working properly. And then there's an on-chain narrative around Gitcoin that you also are in charge of managing, and not yours anymore. In many ways, you've now set the stage so that everyone else can decide what they want GTC to be. But how do you think about those two things? There's the on-chain stuff that's associated, and not just using Gitcoin. Even if you go one step out, it's like Uniswap has the DEX, the AMM, and then they have Uniswap DAO and the cultural thing that is Uniswap. Right? How do you think about those two in your day-to-day, I guess?
I think that blockchain-based systems are really great to use when you need mutability and transparency, and there's an economic game that you're playing where you need to have consensus. But that space also has its downsides in that it's expensive. There's scarcity there. And there's really two layers to, I think, a lot of these socioeconomic systems and blockchains. There's like the social layer and sort of the brand mission, all the things that you would interact with any consumer brand with or community with. And then there's the on-chain stuff that happens. And I think that there's a really interesting interplay between the memes and the mechanisms in a lot of these systems. In a lot of ways, a lot of blockchains just come down to memes and mechanisms, and they play off of each other. And the fun thing about Gitcoin grants is that before I go on, like, I just want to like put my hand to the sky and like confess to you all that like Gitcoin, the technology stack is centralized right now. Like, I confess, you got me like centralized, and it's because we wanted to find a space where we could play an economic game that people actually cared about. And if we had built this perfectly like battle tested, immutable economic system to start, then we wouldn't have rapidly iterated towards something that people actually care about. And so we found a equilibrium where we have product market fit, and now we're going to be evolving into a protocol where provably the mechanism interplays with the blockchain in a incredibly neutral way. And so we're sort of iterating towards this cycle in which the memes and the mechanism interact with the blockchain and create this virtuous cycle that funds public goods. And it's really been a lot of fun to use different parts of my, like the part of my brain that creates memes is totally different from the part of my brain that does programming, but you need to bring it all together in order to make it work. And I see the same thing with Kernel, you know, with Andy's sort of wit and character, and Vivek, you administering it and leading it forward and building a brand here. So I think you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, Vivek, and I was like, the mechanism behind Gitcoin grants is quadratic funding, but like, what's the mechanism behind Kernel? And I think the mechanism is actually very simple and elegant, which is like take 250 people who are some of the top people in the space, most promising founders in the space, and put them together and see like what that creates. And it's really simple and elegant, but it's also working really well. And so I think that y'all are mostly completely at the social layer, right? Although we're going to start experimenting with some like blockchain based coordination mechanisms for Kernel soon. I hope, and I'm excited about that.
Yeah. Memes and mechanisms, really simple and succinct way to describe what's going on. I think it's really cool. And yeah, I agree. Cool. Okay. There's one kind of like big convo happening in chat around marketing and memes manipulation. It's just interesting to me, this concept, because I really do think memes in crypto have obviously like already shown their importance well beyond like Instagram's need to meme and to like build a brand in the same way, or build a community in the same way. You can already see that there's just a shift in focus, and it's becoming clear that that gap is growing. I think that my question maybe would be to
Is this
maybe,
about beneficial manipulation is what I see in the Zoom chat?
I think it is. I don't know if Naomi perhaps would be willing to like try to summarize what's been going on, and if there are any questions that we want to end on. With anyone else who's been involved in the conversation.
I think the question is like, when does a mechanism become manipulation, and when is manipulation toxic, or
can there be beneficial manipulation where you manipulate somebody, but it's for their own good?
Well, I mean, as someone who's 35 and sits in a computer chair all day, I think it's beneficial manipulation when I go to my chiropractor. It's a little joke for anyone who's over 40 in the 35 in the audience.
You know, as a parent, when my child tries to walk in front of a car and I grab her and pull her back, that's beneficial manipulation.
Yeah, I think that, like, you know, for me, what it comes down to is the consent of the governed. Like, my chiropractor has my consent to manipulate me, and their toddler walking in front of the car, maybe by virtue of you being their parent, like, you have consent to do that thing. What really matters to me is when you have an extractive group that's calling the shots about what mechanisms to implement to a community, and they don't have the consent of the governed. And you know, to me, that's the line between toxic manipulation and not. But I'd be curious for pushback on that, and if there's a better way of framing it.
A brief piece on that, on the power that we have as consumers, let alone the design and the technologist part of things. People gain power by voting in the current systems, and they also open their wallets. That's another way for them to sort of vote for what companies to support, to see the change they seek to see, to implement in society, with shared purpose, with core beliefs that might align, and at scale. I don't think that becomes manipulation if it's through an authentic relationship with the company or the brand or the person who's heralding that brand, and that's demonstrated via actions and storytelling to build up that reputation is really interesting. Just a note on that. We all have some sort of power there. And good notes on the consent piece and the definition between what is manipulation and what isn't. And I borderline, like, people are like, isn't that manipulation sometimes? When you're using like social proof points, when you're using design patterns to kind of move people to take an action on a website or landing page, for example.
Yeah. Amazing. At the risk of going a few minutes over, and thank you if anyone has to drop, there is one last question that feels like the right one to end on from Alon. And William, your question ties here. The idea is going back to the idea of the truth and building tools that enable access to these truths. Andy, in this module, describes value with others as shared truths. And maybe, Andy, you can expand if you'd like to. But how do we build systems that lead us in that search, as opposed to the opposite of that being the ways that they take our attention? So how do we build tools in that direction? If there's any closing thoughts on that idea.
The argument made in value is that it's through fiction that we create shared truths. Fiction is the lie that reveals the truth. The reason why it's important to phrase it that way is that you cannot say the truth directly. Right? To give a metaphor that will appeal to both Alon and William, you cannot say the name of God. The closest you can get is the Tetragrammaton, right? Yahweh, but that's not actually, it's Yavhe, Vavhe, but that you can't say it because there's no diacritical marks in Hebrew. There's no vowel indication. So there's no way you can say the name, both physically, but also on a conceptual level. You cannot say what the truth is. You can only tell a story which is self-reflexively and self-consciously aware of its own limitations, because in being honest and humble about the limitations that you yourself operate within, the limitless, which is the source of anything that is said, done, or that appears and manifests in the world is already there. And it's the self-reflexivity and the efficiency of the language with which you use to tell your fiction that allows you to be clear, precise, humble, and honest about what the limits are, such that the limitless, which is already within it and after it and before it and beyond it and beneath it, is revealed. This is why in every wisdom tradition across the world, it's always through negation. It's neti neti, or dahi daha, any one of another 1,000. It's just the 10 oil paintings of the Zen tradition, because you can't actually write any words. But what we can do is play. We can play these shared stories that are self-reflexively and self-consciously aware of what we can share. And if we do that with humility and honesty, then we have to trust in the rest.
Amen.
Yeah.
I hate to do this, but I have a hard stop at 10:30 Mountain Time, and I got to run. I just wanted to end by conveying my gratitude to Andy and to Vivek for creating this space. Having hung out with you at DevCon and having some late night conversations, it's cool to see the genesis of Kernel and seeing it grow and having such a positive impact on all of these people. And I hope to be sister DAOs with Kernel in the future. As a token of my gratitude, I am just going to pop into the Zoom chat a coupon code for the Gitcoin store for 50% off any Ethereum or Gitcoin swag that y'all want to order. And the code is Gitcoin Hearts Kernel. So if any Kernel fellows want to get there's some great Ethereum swag on there and some Gitcoin stuff. Vivek will have to get some Kernel stuff off at some point.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Kev.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Awesome.
Bye.
Peace. Thanks to everybody. We'll be here. I think Ann is going to do a clubhouse, but thank you for joining. I think
come through.
LOL. Thank you everybody. I think that's all we got today, but we'll keep it rolling. Next week is module 2. We'll have Rebecca from Zerion hopefully joining us, plus maybe somebody else for the global financial system. So excited to continue exploring. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, guys.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. That was awesome.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Like clockwork, the bye chorus. All right.